All right, hello and welcome back. This week we are talking about sexual orientation and sexual fluidity and the intersection of those identities with other identities that we all hold. So, to start with, of course, we need to think about how we're defining sexual orientation. And our current understanding of sexual orientation is really determined by the gender, or perhaps the biological sex, but really the gender of people involved. So, if we're thinking about the way in which we define our sexual orientation, many of us might identify as straight or gay or lesbian or bisexual or some other identity. Often those words or the origin of those identities are grounded in the gender of the partners or people involved. So if we think about heterosexuality, that hetero prefix means different. And so a heterosexual person is somebody who's in a relationship or other sexual encounter with somebody of a different gender. Whereas homosexual, which is our old-fashioned term for gay or lesbian folks, that homo prefix means same. And then we can think about bisexuality, that bi meaning two or being attracted to both men and women, which of course that definition has expanded a bit to include folks that are outside the gender binary. But many of the words that we use, pansexual, asexual, have those prefixes that are linked to our sort of dominant understanding of sexual orientation as really invested in the gender of people involved. That definition, of course, is socially constructed and has been developed across a long swath of history, and there are many other options or ways in which we could organize or identify in terms of our sexual behavior. We could think about identifying, rather than the gender of the people involved or the people we're attracted to, identifying based on what behaviors or things we like to do sexually. We could think of identifying around what time we like to have sex or how frequently we like to have sex, the number of partners that we have or prefer either in a single sexual encounter or across the lifespan. We could think about if we're invested in different types of power relations, and we often see some of these come out in more colloquial identifications around sexual identity or subgroups. So thinking about power relations, that's often sometimes about top and bottom if folks identify in that way, and thinking about the ways in which we do identify our sexuality in terms of some of these other things, but the dominant way of understanding sexual orientation is very much around gender. And this understanding of sexuality or sexual orientation really only dates from the 19th century, the early to mid 1800s. And we've talked a lot about the way in which historical change has influenced sexuality in various ways, and really growth and shifts in populations away from small rural communities that were mostly self-sufficient to larger urban communities, and just a huge growth in population due to advances in medicine and industrial production. We could now feed much larger populations of people, and had ways to sort of take on larger populations in a single space. As populations grew, states needed new ways of categorizing or regulating people, and so we see the rise of population statistics and the census. And statistics are literally numbers for the state. How do we count and keep track of all the people that are in our country? And so as part of that, we have a shift in focus from sexual behavior, especially around same-sex sexual behavior as just being sort of something that people did, to homosexuality as an identity category or as a group of people. And that classification was really fueled by developing medical and psychiatric professions who were interested in classifying people in different ways. And so the creation, so to speak, of the homosexual really doesn't happen until the mid-19th century or the mid-1800s. And of course, people have been engaging in same-sex sexual behaviors since basically forever. But until that point, we really didn't have an understanding of gay people as a category or a class of people. But of course, in creating homosexuality, we also ended up creating heterosexuality. So while we have a lot of social narratives about the naturalness of heterosexuality, it really wasn't until we started classifying people at all in regards to to their sexuality as a social group or as something that was an important individual defining characteristic, that we have this creation of heterosexuality. And so at that point, sexuality really went from something you do to being someone you are, and that has had wide-ranging impact in terms of sexual engagement, as sexual identity, but also in terms of social movements, right? Without an understanding of gay people as a distinct class of people apart from heterosexuals, we don't have things like a gay rights movement. One of the other things around sexual orientation we want to talk about is that we often conflate many different aspects of sexuality into a single identifier, when really there are many different components of sexuality. Three big ones that we might think about are sexual desire or attraction, which might be distinct from someone's sexual behavior, the actual acts or sexual practices that they engage in, which also might be distinct from the sexual identity or the label that they take on. And so while all of these are somewhat related, they are also distinct, and they don't always fit together the way that we think they should, and I'll put that "should" in very big air quotes, or the way that we assume that they do. And for everyone, sexuality is often complex, it's nuanced, it's individualized, and it's very socially influenced. So for some, sexuality can be very fluid and change over the life course. For some, it's much more stable or static. And the social norms shift around sexual identity and sexuality and in our culture may also impact what people feel is safe or comfortable in expressing, which may lead to some more homogenized or less nuanced expression of sexual orientation public-facing, but for most of us, our experience of sexuality is incredibly complex and nuanced. Of course, we can't talk about sexual orientation or sexuality without talking about compulsive heterosexuality. This is one of the major forms of social control around sexual orientation and sexuality. And compulsive heterosexuality is the social assumption that everyone is and should be straight, which then leads to social processes and norms that make heterosexuality quote-unquote required for social legibility or visibility. And so these are the processes that assume everyone is heterosexual, and this can be, for example, on most birth certificates, there is a listing for a mother's name and a father's name, which presumes that every child has one male parent and one female parent, when that is not necessarily the case. But all the way up to the fact that in recent years we've had constitutional amendments proposed, or state constitutional amendments defining marriage as between one man and one woman. Some of those are still in the Constitution, although the Supreme Court has rendered those moot, essentially, with the legalization of same-sex marriage. But the fact that that needed to be a thing that had to be legalized, same-sex marriage, also is an example of the wide-ranging intensity of compulsive heterosexuality. So heterosexuality, because of this, is often signaled to others through the performance of normative masculinity for men or femininity for women, and compulsive heterosexuality and normative gender presentation are incredibly tightly interwoven. And so thinking about the ways in which sexual dominance is often a key element of heteronormative masculinity, so male dominance over women, heterosexual submission and availability as a key element of normative femininity. And so the ways in which we define or understand what it means to be a quote-unquote real man or quote-unquote real woman is often deeply linked to heterosexuality. And the way that we demonstrate our sexuality, particularly heterosexuality, is often through the performance of particular gender norms. And of course, there are very many and multiple ways to be masculine or feminine, but not all expressions of these are valued or rewarded equally by society. And of course, the public or social reception of these gender performances also depend deeply on who is performing masculinity or femininity, right? And these are so deeply interwoven that the way in which we often see quote-unquote gay people is through non-normative gender presentation. So the social understanding that gay men are feminine presenting men and lesbian women are masculine presenting women is rooted in this link between heterosexuality and normative gender performance. Of course, we know that not all gay men are feminine presenting and not all lesbian women are masculine presenting, but that is the dominant social paradigm. There's also a correlated privileging of monogamy as part of compulsive heterosexuality, or at least a serial monogamy, right? So being in a relationship with one person and one person only at a time, and that used to be much more strict, of potentially even literally being with one person for your entire life, which has loosened a bit to potentially thinking about serial monogamy, being in a relationship with one person at a time, and then when you break up with that person, being in a different relationship with a different single person. And of course, there are many more ways of being in relationship with others, but the hegemony of monogamy, the sort of overarching dominance of monogamy as a social norm, often makes it difficult for folks to even conceive of alternative relationship structures like polyamory, although this is changing. And certainly the rise of hookup culture and the growing acceptance of premarital sex for young people has sort of loosened the stranglehold that monogamy has on our understandings of good sexuality, but certainly often still that hookup culture is seen as a preamble, as a way to get things out of your system to find that one true person. So a lot of our sexual narratives come with not only a presumption of heterosexuality, but also a presumption of monogamy as the ultimate way of being a sexual person. When thinking about same-sex sexual behavior, one, we know that many people engage with those behaviors going back to the Kinsey studies, where that was a major finding, that same-sex sexual behavior was much more prominent than many people had thought. This type of behavior is sometimes, but not always, linked to an identity. So not everyone who engages in same-sex sexual behavior will identify as gay or lesbian or some non-heterosexual identity. Part of the reason for this is that these identities, gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, and on through the LGBTQ plus acronym, these identifications or labels that folks take on are often linked to social subgroups or different cultural practices or social scripts about identities. And so if folks are not, don't feel identified with or don't feel like they fit with the sort of cultural norms or practices of these communities, they may not feel as though they identify with that label and may still identify as straight or heterosexual while engaging in same-sex sexual behavior. And so thinking about straight identified folks that engage in same-sex behavior, oftentimes because that is a disconnect between the behavior and the identity, right? So we assume that when people say they're heterosexual or straight, it means they are engaging with in sex with and are attracted to folks of a different gender. And in our binary gender system, that would be men and women being attracted to and having sex with one another. And so in order to manage this disconnect, this social disconnect and social assumption, often folks who participate in same-sex behavior and are straight identified use a variety of narrative behavior strategies narrative strategies to recode the behavior as heterosexual rather than as gay or lesbian or bisexual. And often these narrative strategies rely on gender norms as proof of heterosexuality. So men might say, well, I'm just really sexual and I need to have an outlet for my sexuality, and it's too much for my woman partner to handle, and so I have sex with men to just let that sexual energy out. And so that identification of masculinity as very sexual, almost hypersexual, that is too much for women's sexuality, too much to be contained by women's sexuality, is one narrative strategy to recode that same-sex behavior as really enforcing one's heterosexuality. And these narratives, these behaviors, these individuals really challenge simplistic understandings of sexual orientation as dependent on the gender identity of participants, right? And so really ask us to open up our thinking about sexual orientation. And I would encourage you to really challenge the category and the definition rather than trying to think about like, oh, well, that those people are really just closeted, right? They're really gay. They just can't admit it yet. While that may be the case for some folks, that is probably not the case for everyone. And so really honoring and validating how people identify themselves, regardless of whether that identity matches up with what you think it should be or what society normatively would assign to that person. We also want to think about how gender and other intersecting identities influence the social response to same-sex sexual practice, and put another way, this sort of framing a question of like, why can two women or two girls kiss each other and not be considered gay when it is much more difficult for men? And I do realize that the distinction between girls and men might be seen as belittling to women, but that's often what we think about in terms of our gendered orientation and gendered sexual double standards. So why is it that two women at a party can kiss one another and not be presumed lesbian, but if two men are kissing at a party, then the presumption is that they are gay? And so how does gender influence our perception of same-sex sexual practice? And how do these relate to things like a sexual double standard for men and women? Lastly, I want to talk about asexuality today as another sexual orientation, or sometimes considered a lack of sexual orientation, that is often misunderstood but also dismissed in terms of being a legitimate identity. So asexuality is defined as a lack of sexual attraction to others, or perhaps as a low or absent interest in or desire for sexual activity. And so asexuality does not mean that folks are celibate. It is not the same as celibacy or abstinence, which both are choices, and often celibacy and abstinence imply a sexual desire that is being denied for an individual reason, either because someone is saving oneself for a later date, or is choosing to remain celibate for various other purposes, such as religious devotion. Asexuality is not the same in that asexual folks generally don't have that sexual attraction to deny or to limit. And so thinking about the way in which asexuality could really be specific around sexual attraction, and while asexual folks may still have a romantic attraction to other people of various genders, and asexual people may still actually have sex if they are in relationships with partners who do identify as sexual in some way, but it's that lack of desire or attraction in themselves that is sort of the defining characteristic of the identity. And asexuality also really challenges our simplistic understandings of sexual orientation, and can really challenge our fundamental presumptions about what it means for sexuality to be natural. We often believe that the three core fundamental pieces of being human are that you eat, you sleep, and you have sex. And asexual folks challenge that, and that is often why there is a strong negative reaction or disbelief of folks who are asexual identified. And I also want to just note that there are an incredible diversity of identities and experiences within the ace community, and ace is often a shorthand label for asexuality. And there are many different ways of being asexual or an asexual identified person. And I want us also, as always, to think about how other intersecting identities influence the experience of asexuality, both for those who identify as asexual themselves, as well as for our social perceptions of asexual people. And in the video that is in the module for this week, you'll notice that it is all folks who appear to be white, and I think that's one real strong narrative around asexuality sexuality is that it's a white people thing when there are folks of all races that identify as asexual, and thinking about other intersecting identities that might influence or make it more difficult for folks to be seen and validated in the identity that they hold. For example, thinking about the social scripts around disability, I presume that folks with disabilities are asexual, and that in pushing back against that narrative, we might overlook the fact that some folks with disabilities might actually also identify as asexual, not because they have a disability, but because that is another identity that they hold. And so really thinking about the different ways that our intersecting identities position us and open us up to social visibility or social, the challenging of our identities as we move through the world.